G'day guys, how are you going? Today we are having a look at the WZ-111 Alpine Tiger. This is of course a very rare tier 8 premium tank that was only ever released on the Chinese server, and now Asia server is getting 50 of these to the top 50 players in the Battle in APAC event currently running on the Asia server. I'll link that down below. But today I've been given this tank as a rental tank. Unfortunately, I don't get to keep it, and I'm certainly not getting in the top 50 players. But I've been given this tank, and I'm going to give you a full review of the tank. Of course, we're going to start with the history of this tank, then we're going to go into its top 3 and its bottom 3 quirks. We're going to give it a brand score, we're going to look at some ace tanker gameplay, and then I'm going to give you my final thoughts on why you guys should really try and grind for this tank, because it is so cool, but it has additional benefits as well. Now, something to keep in mind as well is this is pretty much the exact same tank. In fact, it is the exact same tank as the standard WZ-111. So that's something you should keep in mind as well. This is not like something that you should think, oh, it's probably better or it could be worse. It's literally the exact same. Obviously, it's got a different paint job on it, but that's literally it, except for one critical thing, and that is this tank gets 2 times the amount of credit experience. It's got an artificial 2 times credit experience booster on it every single time you play. So this thing is monstrous at being able to gain credits in World of Tanks, gain silver, and that is what makes this tank even more special than its amazing looks. I think this tank looks absolutely beautiful. Of course, you purists out there won't like it, but I think objectively speaking, this tank is a very good looking tank. So let's talk about the history of the tank now. Well, the WZ-111 was a Chinese attempt to improve upon the Soviet T-10 heavy tank development. Once completed, the WZ-111 was supposed to replace all Soviet-made IS-2 and IS-3 tanks in the People's Liberation Army service. I think that's how you say it anyway. However, due to the design shortcomings, only one prototype was completed before the fall of 1964, when development was ultimately cancelled. Flaws that were found during initial testing included a heavy and very cramped turret interior, insufficient armor on the hull, and a weak and unreliable engine that was struggling to propel the overall mass of the vehicle. Most of the technology used in the WZ-111 were copies of earlier, close to obsolete Soviet solutions. Turret design was cast steel with welds on the roof area, fitted with 2 crew hatches and a commander's periscope. Suspension consisted of 7 road wheels with internal shock absorbers, 3 support rollers, and a drive sprocket positioned at the rear with a removable ring gear and guide wheel. The transmission was similar to the one in the IES series and featured a multi-disc dry main clutch, 8-gear transmission with dual planetary rotation mechanisms and a final drive. The engine was actually a Chinese-made unlicensed copy of the B11 diesel, with the maximum power output at 520 horsepower. Maximum speeds achieved during tests was 35 kilometers per hour. The body was made from welded plates with a thickness of 13, 120, 90, and 60 millimeters. The test prototype was preserved and today is actually placed on permanent display in the Chinese Tank Museum located near Beijing. Now onto the top 3 and the bottom 3 quirks of this tank. So first of all, it has very strong frontal hull armor against many of the opponents that it meets. Also, it has a high top speed of 50 kilometers per hour, which means that this tank can very much shift it around the battlefield when it reaches that top speed. And finally, it has preferential matchmaking, although what kind of significance does that have at the moment? As we've seen by other YouTubers, they've put out that really most tanks won't see, most tier 8 tanks anyway, are not going to see tier 8 games, and they're going to be much more likely to see tier 9 and even more so likely to see tier 10 games. So that's something to keep in mind. How important that is anymore is up for you to decide. Now, the bottom 3 quirks of this tank is that it has very bad gun handling, and it is so frustrating to play when you're driving this tank. It's just the bloom on the gun is huge, the aiming time is okay, but just everything else about it is just not good at all. Now, also the ammo rack is pretty much damaged every second hit that this tank receives. It is quite terrible how often the ammo rack on this tank does go. It's so frustrating. And also its regular penetration. So the penetration on its regular ammunition is very, very poor at 175 millimeters. It's the same as the IS-6, 112, all those Russian, what are they, the D25T kind of guns out there. It's just that bad, and it can't penetrate pretty much anything at tier 8 plus. You're going to struggle with this gun unless you are able to fire heat rounds. But I suppose that if you are firing the heat premium rounds, well, at least you get that 2 times credit making ability. So let's go ahead and give this tank a brand score. So the DPM of this tank is 1,872, giving it a 5 out of 10. It's certainly not the best, but it's not the worst either. Penetration wise, it has a pretty poor penetration of 175 millimeters, giving it a 5 out of 10. Again, not really great. There are many other tier 8 tanks with way more penetration than this. Even the poor penetration on the standard T32 is way better than this at 198 millimeters. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Gun handling wise, this is where the tank is pretty poor. The shown dispersion value is 0.44, giving this tank a 3 out of 5, and that's really bad accuracy. I mean, have a look at the KV2, it's not much worse than this. And also the hidden dispersion value average of this tank is an okay 0.173, giving it a 4 out of 5. Still not amazing, and it really is ruined by that shown dispersion value. Now, aiming time of the tank is 3 seconds flat, which is actually quite impressive for this kind of gun, Russian gun anyway, giving it a 6 out of 10. The gun vertical movement, or the gun depression and gun elevation, well, the gun depression of this tank is 5 degrees, which is very poor, but it's something to be expected because it is a Chinese tank, I suppose, and that gives it a 2 out of 5. And the gun elevation on this tank is actually quite impressive at 23 degrees, giving it a 3 out of 5. That's not something that you see very often on these kind of big, heavy tanks. Now, the survivability of this tank is it's okay. Let's go over to the tank viewer in the armor schematic viewer, and I'll give you my exact thoughts. So here we have the visual model. If you have a look at it from the front, you can see that its upper frontal plate is actually pretty good, and that's because it is a pike nose design. But what that means is if you angle it a little bit over angle, then if you over angle it, I should say, then you're going to make the effective armor a lot worse. So the thing about this tank is you need to keep it dead straight on, and that can be quite scary at times because, you know, we're used to angling our armor on a lot of different tanks. But if you do it on this tank, it makes the armor weak and almost completely ineffective. It has a very large lower frontal plate, which gets penetrated quite easily. It was buffed in patch 9.17, but this is not enough. Things can go through it very, very easily indeed. Now, the turret on the tank is, of course, very good. That's something we can expect. It's a Chinese tank. It's a Russian tank knockoff. So it's very good all over. It does have 2 pretty big cupolas on top, though. That's something to keep in mind. However, they're not necessarily that easy to hit. And if you hit up at the top region, it's just going to go through and go through nothing because there's a bit of space armor at the top. But if you hit the cupolas themselves, then it will go through. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, it does, of course, have the almighty Russian spaced armor on the side of the tank, so you can get some ridiculous angles, because why not? This thing is awesome at side scraping. The thing is, it doesn't have the most amount of armor on the side of the tank, but it's 80 millimeters, and that's plenty to be able to side scrape in this tank. But you do run the risk of exposing your frontal plate because it will be angled, and that makes it a lot weaker. So again, you know, there's drawbacks to having the pike nose. So you really got to keep this tank dead on to be able to use it effectively. And if you can hide that lower frontal plate, then you become a very formidable force indeed. Now, the issue with the armor on this tank now is that while it used to be godlike and people were really scared of this tank, I mean, with all the recent introductions or the buffs at tier 8, tier 9, tier 10, things can go through this so easily. You know, don't expect to bounce many tier 8, tier 9, tier 10 shells. Or tier 10 you're not even going to find, but tier 8 and tier 9, don't expect to bounce too many shells because it's not going to be able to do that. It's really not that great at it. It can bounce shells, but it's not something that you can unfortunately rely on anymore, especially with your really poor armor piercing penetration at 175 millimeters. You don't want to get up into the face of another tank because it might not help you out very much. The penetration on the heat rounds are good, but they're not. Yeah, they're not good enough to be able to to be able to go out in the face of the enemy and be able to do well, in my opinion, because one, the shell velocity is very slow, two, it's heat, so the normalization of the shell hitting the tank is not great. So that's something to keep in mind as well. This tank really will require you to fire a lot of heat rounds, as I've said. But back to the armor, it's pretty good all around, but don't expect it to do the world. It'll bully tier 7, tier 6 tanks, no worries. Tier 8 tanks, maybe tier 9 tanks, forget about it. And as such, guys, this tank gets a 7 out of 10 for its armor. I mean, it's pretty good, but it's certainly not up there with, for instance, the Defender. It has nothing on that tank, and that's what it's competing with. It really is. So the mobility of this tank, well, this tank has a power to weight ratio of 13.48 horsepower to ton, giving it a 2 out of 5. Which is okay. I mean, this tank will reach its top speed quite often. It shifts around the battlefield. It honestly does. And it also has an average traverse speed of 26 degrees per second, giving this tank another 2 out of 5. Now, that is quite slow, but it's not horrific. Light tanks will still, I think, struggle to get around you because you have a combined traverse speed of about 52 degrees per second, which is not too slow at all. So this tank, while don't expect it to run rings around any tank, it's still okay with its mobility. Now, the view range of this tank is 380 meters, which gives it an 8 out of 10. That is actually quite good for a tier 8 heavy tank. The concealment while stationary or camouflage value of the tank is also actually surprisingly good at 7.89%, and that gives it a 4 out of 10. While it's not amazing, guys, remember it is a heavy tank. The value of the tank, well, this is where things become interesting. I think this tank is incredibly valuable, and I think you'll agree with me, but that's because it's so rare. I don't think we're going to be able to see this tank very often. I think it's going to be released for short bursts, for competitions, kind of like the Type 59. It's one of those tanks that it really does turn heads. It is an okay tank to play, and with its 2 times credit boosting abilities, that does make it very valuable in my opinion, because this thing is able to print credits so well. Better than any other tank I've ever played. I've been speaking to some of the other community contributors from World of Tanks Asia server, and they say that they're able to fire completely heat and still turn a profit, and that's something that I've noticed as well. This tank is absolutely insane at doing that. So overall, guys, I'm giving this tank a perfect 10 out of 10. I think this is a really valuable tank just because it's so rare, just because it's free as well. For now, I don't think they're ever going to sell it, so I'm going to say it's free for now as well. And also it has that incredible credit printing ability. So yeah, guys, 10 out of 10 for value for this one. And thus, the final brand score for this tank is 61 out of 100. Now, this places it pretty evenly compared to other tanks. I think you'll agree with me that this tank is a pretty cool tank, and regardless of its brand score, of its overpoweredness, I suppose, this tank is a pretty solid tank, and something I'd love to see in my garage, but I don't think I'm ever going to be able to have this one in my garage ever. So guys, here we have Matchy HK playing in the WZ-111 Alpine Tiger. Of course, that's what this tank is, and we're playing on Live Oaks here. Now, if you don't know, Matchy is a streamer and a World of Tanks community contributor, so I'll leave his link down in the description below. But anyway, guys, you can see here we have the WZ-11 Alpine Tiger on in a game, and you can see the way it looks is absolutely beautiful. The way that the sun hits it and whatever, it is really silver. So it looks just like it's been made of solid silver, and I think it looks absolutely awesome personally. Now, in this game, you can see that he is now moving. I'm going to reduce the map a little bit. Yeah, so we can see that he is moving over to the southern flank, I suppose you'll call it, on this map. This is probably where I would always recommend going. You really do want to take this side of the map, because if you don't take this side of the map, chances are you will lose the game. That's just kind of how I see it. Some people disagree with me, but I think some of you will agree with me as well. He started with AP rounds loaded, but now he's changed over to the heat rounds with 250 millimeters of penetration, because he's seen an IS-3 and he knows he can't do anything against the IS-3. Here we have the 112, who's gone straight in front of his gun. He's got a hit into the side of him, so absolutely fantastic so far. He bounces a shot. To be expected, that 112 has the same gun on his tank, and that has very poor penetration, and so he's going to struggle to get through the front of his tank no matter how Matchy angles the tank. That 112 is getting picked apart. Heat was fired at him, but he did bounce it. And then Matchy bounced his heat shell off the lower frontal plate of that 112. So that was quite unfortunate, but happens. RNG happens in this game, as I'm sure we are all very, very aware. So now he's going to take care of that IS-3. He's also going to take care of the T-34-3, the recently HD model tank that has got a buff in its armor. Now that's something I want to show you as well. This tank really is so bad at hitting shots from anything further than 10 meters away in front of the tank. It's very, very frustrating that it can't just hit tanks. That was a lucky shot. Most of the time, guys, the shots for me do not go in the front of the tank. Now we can see that a lot of tanks now firing HE at him. IS-3 is firing premium rounds at him, but these are bouncing as well. And we can see on the front of the tank that a few of them have bounced off the upper frontal hull, and also I think we have possibly one or two. It's really hard to tell because the whole tank is silver, and of course the marks of the shells are left in silver, so it's difficult to tell, but he has bounced the tanks at the front, some shells off the front of the tank, so that is quite impressive. Remember, the upper frontal plate is quite strong at the top of it. As you go towards the bottom, it doesn't become as strong, but the turret on this tank is really good as well. Artillery started taking shots off at him. Nothing you can do about it there. And he can't fix his crew as it's already stunned. So he's just firing into the IS-3 as best as he can. It's still really impressive that the shells have gone where he wants to go, especially since the crew was damaged. But RNG, right? So if we have a look at the northern flank, we can see that the town has pretty much been overrun. So I don't think those tanks are going to hold up very long at the top. His gun has been damaged. He can't fix it, but he'll soon be able to. And if this gun's damaged, then good luck at hitting anything, honestly. So I'm sure he'll fix it as soon as he can. Which he has. That IS-3 is playing quite aggressively, but he's doing pretty well, holding off quite a few tanks. He does get tracked, but I think it went into that troll armor on the side and just took off his tracks at the same time. So it's very lucky there for Matchy. But, well, I suppose there's nothing to complain about, really. He is able to go around and really bully this Churchill 7. He's changing over to the AP rounds here, but you can see he's used pretty much all, not all, but the majority of his premium rounds, and that's something that happens in this tank. So if you do get one, you've got to keep that in mind, that this is something that you're going to have to fire premium rounds very, very often, and for that reason, it might not be the best at making credits. Even though it does have that booster, it may struggle in situations like what Matchy has found himself in against pretty mediocrely armored tanks at tier 8, like the IS-3. The armor on that thing really isn't that great anymore, but he still has to load up those premium rounds to be able to go through the front of it. He will not be able to go through the front of that IS-3 if he was using standard rounds. Here Matchy is trying to communicate with the rest of the team, telling them to defend, and that is important because right now he has to deal with about 6 tanks, 5 tanks, and 1 artillery. And that artillery can really ruin his day. Luckily for Matchy, he hasn't lost a single hit point of health. Even with all that HE fired at him, all those shells fired at him, he's blocked all of those shells. That's something that I have not been able to do in this tank. I really struggle to play this tank personally. A, because I'm just bad, and B, because I think this tank is not that great, especially with gun handling. It's just so terrible, actually. So Matchy's heading back to base because he was really concerned that might be overrun very quickly, but it looks like the enemy team has been slowly picked apart by the Type 59 and the T20 on the team as well. Especially that Type 59. Shout out to him. He's playing very, very well this game as well. That A43 is now going to have a very rude awakening. You can see how long he has to sit there and aim for. But he didn't quite penetrate the A43, that tier 6 medium tank's armor, which is very, very unlucky and unfortunate for Matchy. Again, nothing he can do. It's the way that this gun works. It's almost like firing a KV2 gun every time, except you don't get the happiness from one-shotting tanks, because this tank isn't like that. There we have the artillery, again, pummeling shells into him. Very frustrating artillery. He takes a blind fire, but that was never going to hit, and I'm sure he knew it at the time as well. Especially at the front of a T-29 turret, there's no way it would have gone through. You can see he was trying to drive a bit oddly there to try and throw off the aiming of that T-29, and it did work. It ricocheted off the frontal plate. And now we can see that Matchy's just going to go bully that T-29. T-29 would struggle to go through him, even with premium rounds at the front of the tank, so he doesn't really have too much to worry about. Now let's skip forward to see where we'll find that artillery, which will probably be hiding somewhere in this city. Took a pot shot, and he has been found and taken out at the end of the game. So 5 kills in total, but let's have a look at the post-game stats to see just how well Matchy did in this game. So Matchy got a Mastery Badge, Ace Tanker, a Bruiser Medal, a Duelist Medal, a Fighter Medal, a Fire for Effect Medal, and a Shell Proof Medal for blocking all the damage that he did, which was a substantial amount. He also got a Cool Headed, a Steel Wall, again for blocking all that damage, and a High Caliber Medal. So very, very well done to you, Matchy. Team score wise, he did of course score the highest amount of damage on his team by quite a significant amount. He did 4,048 damage, and even though that Type 59 only did 1,500 damage, he was able to pick away at the enemy team, getting 5 kills. So in this game, Matchy got 1,533 base experience, and you can see he made a profit of 61,000 credits, even though he fired a huge amount of premium rounds. And as I said, guys, this thing just absolutely prints credits. And this was not necessarily an amazing game. Like, sure, he did 5,000 combined damage, but this tank has a lot more potential in it to do even more amount of damage. Think about all the shells that he missed or that didn't penetrate. This tank is quite formidable on the battlefield indeed. But anyway, guys, enough babbling on. Let's get back to the garage, and I'll give you my final thoughts on this tank and whether you guys should go ahead and pick this up and have it in your garage by grinding for it, because it is a pretty hard grind. So guys, my final thoughts on this tank. Well, should you get this tank in your garage? I think 100% if you can get it in your garage, get it. You might not ever be able to get this tank again. There might only ever be 50 of these given out, and if there are more given out, I can almost guarantee you that it's not ever going to be something that's for sale. It's going to be a very, very rare tank, and if I could get it, I would. I know I'm not going to be able to get it, but if you are thinking about putting more time into World of Tanks to be able to get this tank, I would say why not? As long as you're not jeopardizing anything else in your life and you have the ability to play the game, for sure, really try and get up into that top 50, because you want this tank. I want this tank, and therefore I'm sure you guys want this tank as well. But anyway, guys, thank you so very much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, please consider leaving it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you're new, comment down below, you know, all that jazz, and I'll catch you next time.